October 26th, 1942, 09:15 hours. 200 miles northeast of Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Ichiro Nakamura pressed his face against the cold metal of his Nakajima B-5N2 Kate torpedo bomber's side window, scanning the empty horizon through the pre-dawn gloom. Behind him, Navigator Sub-Lieutenant Kenji Yamada called out coordinates, while radio operator Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka crouched at the rear gun position, his single 7.7mm Type 92 machine gun pointing skyward, waiting for American fighters that hadn't yet appeared. Through breaks in the cloud cover below, Nakamura spotted it. The unmistakable profile of an American aircraft carrier, its deck packed with planes, steaming at high speed in a desperate attempt to launch fighters before the Japanese strike arrived. USS Hornet, the third American flat top that Japanese Kate torpedo bombers would send to the bottom in 5 months. Carrier confirmed, Yamada announced, his voice steady despite the moment's magnitude. Range 8,000 meters. Target bearing 030. Nakamura's hands tightened on the control stick. 5 months ago, in May, Kate torpedo bombers from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku had devastated USS Lexington at the Coral Sea, their Type 91 torpedoes ripping open the massive carrier's hull. 4 weeks later at Midway, more Kates had crippled USS Yorktown so badly that a submarine finished her off. Now, here was Hornet, alone and vulnerable, the perfect target. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. America had entered the war with 7 carriers. Japan had sunk or helped sink 4 of them. Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, and now Hornet would be the 5th. The Americans were losing carriers faster than they could build them. Every Japanese pilot knew this. The war of attrition was working. All aircraft, this is strike leader, the radio crackled. Begin torpedo attack approach. Dive to attack altitude. Maintain formation spacing. Nakamura pushed the stick forward. The Kate responded smoothly, dropping from 3,000 meters toward the wave tops. Around him, 9 more Kate torpedo bombers from the carrier Junyo descended in perfect formation, each carrying a single 800-kilogram Type 91 torpedo beneath its fuselage. The weapons had been specifically modified for Pearl Harbor, wooden fins to stabilize them in shallow water, but they worked just as well in the open ocean. The descent was terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously. Nakamura had flown Kates for 3 years, trained until every maneuver was instinctive, practiced torpedo drops until he could place a weapon within meters of any target. He was part of an elite force, the best carrier aviators in the world, flying the best torpedo bomber ever built. The Kate itself was a marvel of 1937 engineering, though by 1942 standards, it was showing its age. Its Nakajima Sakai Model 11 radial engine produced 1,000 horsepower, enough for a top speed of 378 kilometers per hour at altitude, faster than the American Douglas TBD Devastator that it had obliterated at Midway. The 3-man crew worked in perfect coordination, trained through thousands of hours together. The pilot flew, the navigator bombardier handled the torpedo release, and the radio operator defended their vulnerable tail with that lone machine gun. What the Kate lacked was armor. No protective plating for the crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks that could survive bullet hits. The Japanese Navy had made a conscious decision: speed and range over survivability. In 1937, when war seemed distant, this seemed reasonable. In 1942, with American fighter pilots learning to exploit the Kate's vulnerabilities, the decision was costing lives. But today, Nakamura wasn't thinking about vulnerabilities. He was thinking about glory. Altitude 50 meters, Yamada called out. Range 4,000 meters. Target speed estimated 30 knots. The ocean surface rushed past beneath them, close enough that spray from the wave tops spattered against the Kate's glass canopy. At this altitude, they were nearly invisible to the carrier's lookouts until the final seconds of the attack. By the time the Americans spotted them, it would be too late. Nakamura could see Hornet clearly now, her deck a hive of frantic activity. American sailors were pushing aircraft toward the catapults, desperate to get fighters airborne. He could see the distinctive profiles of F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Too late. Far too late. "Flak opening up," Tanaka reported from his rear position. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire began appearing in the sky around them, the Americans' desperate attempt to stop the inevitable. The formation split smoothly, 5 Kates banking left to attack from the port bow, 5 more, including Nakamura's, staying on course to strike from starboard. The classic pincer attack, pioneered at Pearl Harbor, perfected at Coral Sea, executed with lethal precision at Midway. American carriers couldn't evade torpedoes coming from 2 directions simultaneously. The mathematics of naval warfare were inescapable. Range 1,500 meters. Yamada's voice remained calm, professional. Torpedo run parameters optimal. Angle of attack confirmed. Nakamura lined up the shot. The carrier grew larger in his sight with each passing second. He could see individual sailors now, running across the deck, manning gun positions, pointing skyward at the incoming attack. He felt a moment of respect for them. They were fighting to the end, even knowing what was coming. At 800 meters, everything slowed down. Training took over. Nakamura's hand moved to the torpedo release lever. His eyes tracked the carrier's course. The torpedo needed to drop at exactly the right moment. Too early, and it would miss astern. Too late, and they'd overfly the target and be torn apart by the carrier's defensive fire. A shell exploded 50 meters to their right. The Kate shuddered from the concussion, but Nakamura held course steady. Another explosion, closer. Shrapnel pinged against the fuselage. Tanaka cursed from his position, the single machine gun chattering in response. Though what good one 7.7mm gun could do against a carrier's massed anti-aircraft batteries was questionable. "Now!" Yamada shouted. Nakamura pulled the release lever. The Kate lurched upward as 800 kilograms of weapon dropped away. He immediately pulled back on the stick, climbing and banking right to escape the wall of flak that would intensify over the target. Behind him, he felt rather than saw the torpedo hit the water, its wooden stabilizing fins keeping it level as it accelerated toward Hornet at 42 knots. The Kate climbed to 200 meters. Nakamura risked a glance back. The torpedo's wake was a white line pointing straight at Hornet's starboard side, just forward of the island superstructure. The carrier was turning, trying desperately to avoid the weapons coming from both sides, but there was no escape. Nakamura's torpedo struck at the waterline with a dull thud that he felt more than heard. A column of water shot upward, maybe 30 meters high, followed by a secondary explosion as something inside the carrier detonated. "Hit! Direct hit!" Yamada was shouting, slapping Nakamura's shoulder from behind. "Perfect shot! Look at her burn!" More torpedoes were striking now as the other Kates completed their runs. Nakamura counted at least 3 more hits, possibly 4. Massive explosions rippled along Hornet's hull. Black smoke began pouring from her hangar deck. Through the smoke he could see flames, the worst thing that could happen to a carrier loaded with aviation fuel and armed aircraft. The Kate formation regrouped at 1,000 meters, circling to assess the damage. What they saw was devastation. Hornet was listing to starboard. her flight deck erupting with explosions as the fire reached armed aircraft. She was clearly dying, though it would take hours for the massive ship to sink. "That's the third American carrier we've killed this year," Yamada said, his voice carrying satisfaction and pride. "Lexington in May, Yorktown in June, now Hornet. How many do they have left?" Nakamura did the mental calculation every Japanese pilot had memorized. "They started the war with 7 carriers total. We've sunk or helped sink 4. They have maybe 3 left operational, Enterprise, Saratoga, and maybe 1 more in the Atlantic. We're destroying them faster than they can build replacements." "The Americans can't sustain this," Tanaka added from his gun position. "Each carrier takes years to build. We're winning the mathematics." The radio crackled with excited voices from other aircraft. The dive bombers, the Aichi D-3A Val bombers that had coordinated with the torpedo attack, were reporting successful bomb hits as well. Hornet had absorbed both torpedo and bomb damage. She was finished. "All aircraft, return to carrier," the strike leader ordered. "Mission accomplished. The American carrier force has been crippled." As Nakamura turned his Kate toward the rendezvous point where Junya waited, he felt the satisfaction of a perfect mission executed flawlessly. The Nakajima B-5N2 had proven itself again. The best torpedo bomber in the world, flown by the best-trained naval aviators in history, achieving results that would echo through the war. They had no way of knowing what was happening 6,000 miles to the east, in shipyards across America that Japanese intelligence had failed to properly assess. They couldn't imagine the scale of industrial mobilization that had begun the moment Pearl Harbor was attacked. They didn't understand that while they were celebrating their 3rd carrier kill of 1942, American workers were simultaneously constructing not 1, not 2, but 17 new carriers of a class more powerful than anything Japan could build. The Kate pilots had won the battle, but they had already lost the war of production, and the numbers that would prove it were being welded together at that very moment in Newport News, Norfolk, Philadelphia, and Quincy. What Nakamura didn't know, what none of the celebrating Japanese aviators could have imagined as they flew back to their carriers that October morning, was that they had just participated in the last successful Japanese carrier strike of the war. The tide was about to turn, and when it did, the mathematics they thought favored them would become the instrument of their complete and utter defeat. The Nakajima B-5N2. Kate had achieved its greatest victories, but the ships it would face in 1943 and 1944 were already under construction, produced by a nation that could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. The best torpedo bomber in the world was about to discover what happened when tactical excellence met industrial abundance. The celebration would be short-lived. The weapon that had just crippled USS Hornet that October morning had been born from desperation 5 years earlier. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a crisis. Their frontline carrier torpedo bomber, the Yokosuka B-4Y, was hopelessly obsolete, a fabric-covered biplane that looked like it belonged in the previous war. As tensions with America escalated and Japan's ambitions in China expanded, the Navy issued an urgent specification: design the best carrier-based torpedo bomber in the world. 2 companies competed for the contract. Mitsubishi submitted the B-5M, a conventional design that played it safe. Nakajima Aircraft Company, led by chief designer Katsuji Nakamura, took risks. The prototype that first flew in January 1937 shocked Navy observers. It was fast, maneuverable, and could carry either a massive torpedo or 800 kilograms of bombs, double the payload of its predecessor. Commander Minoru Genda, who would later plan the Pearl Harbor attack, flew the prototype himself. His report to Naval Aviation Headquarters was emphatic. "This aircraft will give Japan mastery of the Pacific. Nothing the Americans or British possess can match it." The Navy ordered immediate production under the designation Type 97 Carrier Attack Bomber. Pilots who transitioned from the B-4Y to the new aircraft found themselves flying what felt like a fighter that could carry a destroyer-killing weapon. The difference was revolutionary. But excellence came with compromises. The Navy's obsession with range and speed meant armor was eliminated entirely. Captain Takejiro Onishi, who would later organize the Kamikaze Corps, raised concerns during the design review in 1938. "The fuel tanks have no protection," he noted, reviewing blueprints in the Navy Ministry building in Tokyo. "A single incendiary round could ignite them." Nakamura, the designer, responded with brutal mathematics. Self-sealing fuel tanks would add 200 kilograms. That reduces range by 150 kilometers and speed by 25 kilometers per hour. The aircraft would no longer meet specifications. "Then we'll train our pilots to not get hit," Onishi concluded. It was typical Japanese military thinking. Superior training and fighting spirit would compensate for material disadvantages. In 1938, with war still theoretical, this seemed acceptable. The first B-5N1 models entered service in 1938 and immediately deployed to China, where they performed reconnaissance and light bombing missions against Chinese forces who possessed minimal air defenses. The aircraft worked perfectly. Japanese confidence soared. But combat revealed flaws. The Nakajima Hikari engine, while reliable, lacked power at high altitude. More critically, the few times Chinese fighters managed to intercept the Kates, the results were devastating. Without armor or defensive armament beyond a single rear-facing machine gun, Kates that lost fighter escort were slaughtered. The Navy's solution was not to add armor, but to add power. In 1939, the B-5N2 variant appeared with the new Nakajima Sake Model 11 engine, the same power plant that would drive the legendary Zero fighter. The additional 150 horsepower increased top speed to 378 kilometers per hour and improved climb rate significantly. The Navy reasoned that a faster aircraft could outrun fighters, compensating for lack of armor. This was the variant that would attack Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Haruo Yoshino graduated from the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal in April 1940 and was immediately assigned to carrier qualification training in the B-5N2. His diary, discovered after the war, provides insight into the rigorous preparation Japanese naval aviators underwent. "Today marks my 47th practice torpedo drop," he wrote in August 1940. "The instructors demand perfection. A torpedo dropped 50 meters too early or too late means mission failure and dishonor. We practice until we can execute in our sleep." The training was brutal. Japanese carrier pilots averaged 700 flight hours before their first combat deployment, more than double what American pilots received in 1941. They practiced torpedo attacks against moving targets in all weather conditions. They learned to coordinate with dive bombers, with each type of aircraft attacking in perfect sequence to overwhelm a target's defenses. Most importantly, they learned to operate as three-man crews with absolute precision. The pilot flew, but the navigator/bombardier commanded the mission. In many cases, the navigator outranked the pilot and made all tactical decisions. The radio operator defended the rear and managed communications. Each man trained for years to fulfill his role perfectly. By December 1941, Japan possessed the most skilled carrier aviation force in history, and the B-5N2 Kate was their primary ship-killing weapon. At 0730 on December 7, 1941, Petty Officer First Class Noboru Kanai sat in the navigator's seat of a Kate bomber aboard the carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu. Behind him, the pilot, Flight Petty Officer Ayozo Fujita, ran through final checks. In the rear seat, Petty Officer Second Class Takeshi Kitaura loaded a fresh ammunition drum into the Type 92 machine gun. "All stations ready," Kanai reported to the pilot. "Torpedo armed and secured. Target Pearl Harbor, Battleship Row, primary focus USS Oklahoma and USS West Virginia." Beneath their aircraft hung an 800-kilogram Type 91 aerial torpedo, modified specifically for this mission. The weapon's wooden fins had been carefully adjusted to prevent it from diving deeper than 12 meters in the shallow harbor water. Standard torpedoes dove to 30 meters or more before leveling out, fatal in Pearl Harbor's 13-meter average depth. The modification was based on British tactics. In November 1940, British Swordfish torpedo bombers had attacked the Italian fleet at Taranto Harbor using similar shallow-running torpedoes. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito, the Japanese naval attaché in Berlin, had flown to Taranto immediately after the attack to study British methods. His report revolutionized Japanese torpedo tactics and made Pearl Harbor possible. "Engine start," Fujita announced. The Sake engine coughed, caught, then settled into a smooth roar. Around them, 39 other Kate torpedo bombers were starting engines, their propellers creating a thunderous cacophony across Akagi's flight deck. At 0740, the first Kate launched, catapulting off the deck into the pre-dawn darkness. Every 30 seconds, another Kate followed. Fujita's turn came at 0748. The aircraft handler signaled. Fujita pushed the throttle forward, and the Kate accelerated down the deck. At the bow, the world dropped away, and they were airborne, climbing into formation with the largest carrier strike force ever assembled. What happened over the next 2 hours would change naval warfare forever. Kanai's Kate was among the 40 torpedo bombers that attacked Battleship Row at 0800. The approach was textbook: low altitude, high speed, attacking from multiple angles simultaneously to overwhelm defenses. Kanai released their torpedo at 800 meters range, directly at USS Oklahoma's starboard side. "Torpedo away," he called, pulling out. Fujita banked hard right, climbing to escape the increasingly intense anti-aircraft fire. Behind them, their torpedo ran true, striking Oklahoma below the waterline at exactly the designed depth. The explosion tore a 12-meter hole in the battleship's hull. 4 more torpedoes hit Oklahoma within minutes. The massive ship capsized in 12 minutes, trapping 400 sailors inside. USS West Virginia took 6 torpedo hits and sank in shallow water. USS California took 2 hits and sank. USS Nevada, trying desperately to escape the harbor, took 1 torpedo and multiple bomb hits before being deliberately beached to prevent blocking the channel. The Kate torpedo bombers had achieved what Japanese planners had deemed their primary objective: crippling the American Pacific Fleet's battleship force. Of the 40 Kates that attacked with torpedoes, only 5 were shot down. The other 35 returned safely to their carriers, their crews jubilant. But even as Japanese pilots celebrated, the seeds of strategic failure had been planted. The 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea and escaped unscathed. Japanese intelligence had assured fleet planners that at least 1 carrier would be in harbor. The carrier's absence would prove catastrophic. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, overall commander of the Pearl Harbor attack, argued for a third strike wave to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and repair docks. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, refused. The risk of American carriers counterattacking outweighed potential gains. "We have accomplished our primary objective," Nagumo announced aboard the flagship Akagi. "The American battleship force is destroyed. We return to Japan victorious." The Kate pilots who had executed the attack so brilliantly had no way of knowing that battleships were already obsolete. The future of naval warfare belonged to carriers and their aircraft. By leaving American carriers intact and the base infrastructure undamaged, they had achieved a tactical victory that ensured strategic defeat. Over the following 6 months, Kate torpedo bombers continued their string of victories. In May 1942, at the Coral Sea, Kates from Shokaku and Zuikaku devastated USS Lexington with 2 torpedo hits that proved fatal. The massive carrier burned for hours before being scuttled. Lieutenant Kenzo Kano, who participated in the Lexington attack, later wrote, "We approached from both sides simultaneously, classic pincer formation. The American fighter defense was fierce. We lost 7 Kates, but 11 of us got through. I saw 2 torpedoes strike almost simultaneously. The carrier shuddered like a wounded animal. We knew she was finished." At Midway in June, despite losing 4 Japanese carriers, Kate torpedo bombers from the surviving carrier Hiryu crippled USS Yorktown with 2 torpedo hits. Though the carrier initially survived and was being towed to safety, a Japanese submarine finished her off days later. By October 1942, when Kate sank USS Hornet at Santa Cruz, the pattern seemed clear to Japanese naval planners. The Kate torpedo bomber, combined with Val dive bombers and Zero fighter escort, could destroy any American carrier. The mathematics of attrition favored Japan. America had started the war with 7 carriers and had already lost 4. Japan still had 6 operational carriers and possessed the most experienced naval aviators in the world. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp was the industrial tsunami building on the other side of the Pacific. In June 1940, before Pearl Harbor, before any Kate had fired a shot in anger, the United States Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act. The legislation authorized construction of dozens of new warships, including multiple aircraft carriers. President Franklin Roosevelt had looked at the gathering war clouds in Europe and Asia and concluded America needed a navy capable of fighting simultaneously in the Atlantic and Pacific. Among the authorized ships was a new class of fleet carriers designated Essex-Class. The first, USS Essex, had its keel laid at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. The attack on December 7th transformed the Two-Ocean Navy Act from ambitious peacetime planning into wartime necessity. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Congress authorized additional Essex-class carriers. The contracts multiplied. Newport News, Norfolk Navy Yard, Philadelphia Navy Yard, Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard, and Fore River Shipyard all received orders. By mid-1942, 13 Essex-class carriers were under construction simultaneously. Worker shifts ran 24 hours a day. Women who had never touched industrial tools learned to weld, rivet, and assemble complex machinery. The shipyards, which normally required 30 months to build a carrier, compressed schedules to 20 months through relentless optimization. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda. She was building the weapon that would destroy the Japanese carrier force. The Essex-class design incorporated lessons from the earlier Yorktown and Lexington classes, but scaled up dramatically. At 27,100 tons standard displacement and 36,380 tons fully loaded, Each Essex dwarfed anything Japan could construct. The flight deck measured 872 feet long and 147 feet wide. The ships could carry 90 to 100 aircraft, more than twice the complement of Japanese fleet carriers. Most importantly, the ships were designed for mass production. Unlike Japanese carriers, which were individually designed masterpieces of naval architecture, Essex-class carriers used standardized components manufactured in factories across America. Engines built in Pennsylvania, steel fabricated in Pittsburgh, electronics produced in New Jersey, all shipped to assembly yards where they came together with assembly line efficiency. While Japanese planners celebrated sinking American carriers in ones and twos, America was preparing to launch them in dozens. Lieutenant Kanai, the navigator who had helped sink USS Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor and USS Lexington at Coral Sea, sensed something was wrong by late 1942. His diary entry from November reflects growing unease. We have sunk or helped sink 4 American carriers, yet their resistance grows stronger, not weaker. The quality of their pilots improves with each battle. Their aircraft, once inferior, now match or exceed our capabilities. Where are these new planes and pilots coming from? We are told America cannot sustain losses, but they sustain them and return stronger. Japanese intelligence had thoroughly underestimated American industrial capacity. Pre-war assessments assumed America, a democracy of individualistic civilians, could never match Japan's martial spirit and centralized command. The assessments proved catastrophically wrong. By December 31, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, USS Essex was commissioned, the first of her class, the first of many. At that moment, 16 more Essex-class carriers were under construction. The mathematics that Japanese pilots thought favored them was about to reverse with crushing finality. The Nakajima B5N2 Kate had achieved everything its designers promised. It was fast, capable, and deadly. Its crews were supremely trained. It had sunk 3 American fleet carriers in 1942. By any tactical measure, it was a success. But success in battle meant nothing when confronting industrial abundance. The Kate pilots had won every engagement. They had executed their missions flawlessly. They had demonstrated that superior training and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages, at least for a while. What they couldn't overcome was simple arithmetic. Japan's entire wartime aircraft production would total 76,000 planes. America would produce 324,750 aircraft. Japan would build 18 aircraft carriers of all types during the war. America would commission 141 carriers, including 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. The best torpedo bomber in the world, flown by the best-trained crews in history, was about to face an enemy that could absorb losses and return with overwhelming force. The celebration of October 1942 would soon give way to the grim reality of 1943 and 1944, when every Japanese carrier strike would face not 3 or 4 American carriers, but 10, 15, 20 at once. The mathematics would become inescapable. And when Japanese pilots finally understood the scale of what they faced, it would be far too late. June 19, 1944. 08:30 hours. 180 miles west of Saipan, Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Kenzo Kano adjusted his position in the navigator's seat of his Nakajima B5N2 Kate, scanning the horizon through morning haze that seemed to stretch forever in all directions. At 32 years old, He was ancient by Japanese naval aviation standards. Most pilots his age were dead, their names enshrined in memorial tablets at Yasukuni Shrine. But Kano had survived Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz through a combination of skill, caution, and what his squadron mates called supernatural luck. Today, he would need all three. Radar contact confirmed, the radio squawked in his headset. Enemy carriers bearing 090, range 150 kilometers, multiple targets. Repeat, multiple targets. Behind Kano, pilot flight petty officer Saburo Ishida, who had been flying Kates since 1940, spoke quietly. Multiple targets. That means at least 3 carriers, maybe 4, like Coral Sea. Maybe more, muttered Petty Officer Takeshi Morita from the rear gunner position. At 24, Morita was the youngest of their crew, but he'd already survived 8 combat missions, a feat that made him a veteran by mid-1944 standards. Kano said nothing. He was running calculations in his head, comparing what they faced now with what he'd experienced in 1942. Their strike force consisted of 16 Kate torpedo bombers from the carrier Zuikaku, escorted by 27 Zero fighters and 53 Val dive bombers. It was a respectable force, larger than many strikes he'd flown. But something felt wrong. The tension in the radio transmissions, the unusual caution from the strike coordinator, the way the veterans in other aircraft weren't joking and boasting as they usually did before combat. All aircraft, this is strike leader. Commander Masaharu Suganami's voice came through clearly. Prepare to adjust course to intercept bearing. Scout reports indicate. There was a pause, unusual for Suganami, who never hesitated. Scout reports indicate enemy task force is larger than anticipated. Exact count uncertain. Maintain formation. Execute attack as briefed. Larger than anticipated, Ishida repeated. What does that mean? It means intelligence was wrong, Kano replied flatly. Again. The formation droned onward. At 10,000 feet, the Kate was at the upper limit of its efficient altitude, the Sake engine working hard in the thin air. Around them, the other 15 Kates maintained perfect spacing. 3 neat group of 5 aircraft each, with the Zero fighters weaving above and the Vals following behind in their own formations. It looked impressive. It should have been more than enough to overwhelm 3 or 4 American carriers. Then they saw the first one. Enemy carrier, 11 o'clock, range 80 kilometers, Morita called from the rear. His voice carried an edge that Kano had never heard before. Kano looked. Through breaks in the haze, he could see a carrier. One of the new Essex-Class, he recognized the profile immediately from intelligence briefings. Large, modern, capable of carrying 90 aircraft. One Essex-Class equaled roughly 2 Japanese fleet carriers in air wing size. I see it, Ishida confirmed. There's another one, Morita said. 1 o'clock, same approximate distance. Kano's stomach tightened. 2 Essex-Class carriers. That was already more firepower than most Japanese strikes encountered. But his eyes kept scanning, professional instinct overriding the growing dread. 3 o'clock, he said quietly. Another carrier. Jesus Christ, Morita breathed, forgetting radio protocol. How many are there? The answer came over the next 5 minutes as the strike formation closed the distance and the haze lifted. Carrier after carrier appeared, spread across 20 miles of ocean in neat formations, each surrounded by a screen of cruisers and destroyers that looked like moving cities of steel. The distinctive profiles of Essex-Class carriers dominated the scene. Flat flight decks nearly 900 feet long, Massive island superstructures bristling with radar antennae, decks packed with aircraft. Kano counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 carriers. Visible simultaneously. And in the distance he could see more masts, more silhouettes that might be additional carriers beyond visual range. "This isn't possible," Ishida said, his voice nearly a whisper. Intelligence said 3 carriers, maybe 4 in the entire task force. There are 7 in front of us right now. 7. "Strike leader, this is Kano," he transmitted, breaking radio discipline. "Confirm target count. Visual identification of 7 enemy carriers. Repeat, 7 carriers." Suganami's response took longer than it should have. "Confirmed. Multiple carrier contacts. All units will execute attack as briefed. Select targets of opportunity. Repeat, select targets of opportunity and execute attack." "They don't know what to do," Morita said from behind. "Intelligence told them 3 carriers. We're looking at 7, maybe more we can't see." Kano's mind raced through the mathematics. 7 Essex-Class carriers meant potentially 630 aircraft. More than the entire Japanese mobile fleet had brought to this battle. But that was impossible. America had started the war with 7 carriers total. Japan had sunk 4 of them. How could there be 7 here, in this one task force 2 years later? Unless Japan's intelligence about American construction capacity had been catastrophically wrong. "We sank Lexington," Kano said aloud, working through the logic. "We sank Yorktown. We sank Hornet. We sank Wasp. 4 American carriers dead. There should be 3 left from the pre-war force. Enterprise, Saratoga, maybe 1 more in the Atlantic. But we're looking at 7 here. Where did they come from?" "They built them," Ishida said, his voice flat with realization. "They built new ones. All of these are new." "In 2 years?" Morita sounded incredulous. "You can't build 7 fleet carriers in 2 years. It's impossible." "Then explain what we're looking at," Ishida snapped. Before Kano could respond, the radio exploded with warnings. "Hellcats! Hellcats incoming! 2 o'clock high!" Kano twisted in his seat, looking up and right. The F-6F Hellcat fighters were diving from 15,000 feet, coming down like hawks on pigeons. He counted at least 20 in the first wave. But more were behind them, and more behind those. The sky seemed filled with American fighters, more than he'd seen in any single engagement. The Zero escorts tried to intercept, but they were outnumbered 3 to 1. Kano watched as the first Zeros engaged the Hellcats in desperate turning fights. The American fighters were heavier, faster, more powerful than Zeros. Where Japanese fighters tried to dogfight using superior maneuverability, the Hellcats simply refused the turning contest, maintaining speed advantage and using boom and zoom tactics that the lighter Japanese fighters couldn't counter. "They're not fighting us," Ishida observed, watching the Zeros try and fail to protect the strike aircraft. "They're running through us to get to the bombers." He was right. The Hellcats ignored the Zeros whenever possible, accepting damage to reach the vulnerable Kates and Vals. A Kate torpedo bomber carried no forward-firing guns, no armor, nothing to defend against a head-on attack. The single rear-facing machine gun was useless against a fighter attacking from ahead. "Hellcat! 12 o'clock level!" Morita shouted. Kano saw it simultaneously. An F-6F Hellcat, painted dark blue, coming straight at them at their own altitude. The American pilot had selected their Kate from the formation, probably recognizing from their position that they carried a squadron leader or experienced crew. The Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns began firing at 800 meters, well beyond the range where Morita's single 7.7mm gun could respond. "Break left!" Kano yelled. Ishida threw the Kate into a hard left turn, the old bomber's airframe groaning under G-forces it wasn't designed to withstand. Tracers arced past the canopy, some rounds striking the fuselage with metallic pings. The Kate shuddered, but kept flying. The Hellcat flashed past, climbing for another attack, but it didn't come back to them. There were too many other targets, too many vulnerable Japanese aircraft scattered across the sky. The American fighter peeled away to attack another Kate, leaving them damaged but functional. "Hydraulics are hit," Ishida reported, checking his instruments. "Rudder response is sluggish. Fuel line might be compromised. I'm showing pressure drop on the number 2 tank." "Can we continue the attack?" Kano asked. "Can we?" Ishida's voice carried bitter irony. "Attack what? Look at this. 7 carriers. We have 16 torpedo bombers left. I can see 3 Kates already going down burning. If we drop all 16 torpedoes perfectly, maybe we hit 1 carrier, 1 out of 7, and they'll replace it in 6 months." "We have our orders," Kano said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our orders were written for an enemy that has 3 carriers," Morita interjected from behind. "Not 7. Not whatever the real number is. Did you see how many Hellcats hit us? At least 50, maybe 100. From 1 task force. How many aircraft do they have?" Kano didn't answer because he didn't want to speak the number his mind had calculated. If each of those 7 carriers carried 90 aircraft, and the Essex-Class could carry more than 90 at surge capacity, that meant 630 aircraft minimum in the task force they were attacking. The entire Japanese mobile fleet had brought 430 aircraft to this battle, and half were already destroyed or damaged. The anti-aircraft fire started at 40 kilometers. It was unlike anything Kano had experienced, even at Pearl Harbor. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells, each burst surrounded by red-hot shrapnel fragments. The Americans had developed proximity-fused shells that exploded when they detected an aircraft nearby, no direct hit required. The new shells turned the air itself into a killing zone. A Kate 200 meters to their left simply disintegrated, hit by a shell that detonated perfectly at its altitude. One moment it was there, the next it was debris falling into the ocean. The crew never had time to realize they were dead. "This is suicide," Ishida said quietly. "We're flying 1937 aircraft against 1944 defenses. We have no armor. 1 burst and we burn." "Then don't get hit," Kano replied automatically, repeating what instructors had told him years ago. "That was fine when we were attacking 2 or 3 ships," Ishida shot back. "We're attacking a fleet. There's nowhere to go that isn't covered by their fire." He was right. The American carriers weren't scattered. They were in formation, their screening ships overlapping fields of fire to create an impenetrable defensive bubble. To attack 1 carrier meant flying through fire from 3 others and a dozen destroyers. "Strike leader is calling the attack," Morita said. "Val dive bombers going in first." They watched as the Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, even more obsolete than the Kates, attempted their attack runs. The Vals were slaughtered. American fighters tore through them. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed them by the dozen. A few got through to release bombs, but the Essex-Class carriers were huge, fast, and maneuverable. Even when bombs hit, the armored flight decks absorbed damage that would have crippled Japanese carriers. 1 Essex took a direct hit, shrugged it off, and continued flight operations. "Torpedo bombers begin attack approach," Suganami ordered. His voice was calm, professional, accepting. The voice of a man who knew he was ordering his pilots to die but saw no alternative. Kano's hands moved automatically, adjusting the torpedo settings, checking the release mechanism. Beside him, Ishida began the descent to attack altitude. Behind them, Morita readied the machine gun for the inevitable fighter attacks during their run. "Which one?" Ishida asked. "Which carrier do we attack?" Kano looked at the 7 massive ships spread across the ocean. It was an absurd question. They were one torpedo bomber with a damaged hydraulic system, attacking 7 fleet carriers surrounded by at least 30 screening ships and hundreds of fighters. It didn't matter which one they chose. The nearest one, he decided. The one at 10 o'clock. She's closest. USS Bunker Hill, Morita read from an intelligence card. Essex-Class. Commissioned September 1943. Air wing of 103 aircraft. 9 months old. The American carrier they were about to attack had been built in less time than it took to fully train a Japanese carrier pilot. The mathematics were inescapable now. "How many of these have they built?" Ishida asked, voicing the question Kano had been avoiding. "Intelligence says 3 or 4 Essex-class by now," Kano replied, knowing the intelligence was wrong. "Intelligence also said there would be 3 carriers total in this task force," Morita pointed out. "We're looking at 7. If they can build 7 carriers in the time intelligence thought they'd build 3, then—" "Don't," Kano interrupted. "Just don't. Focus on the attack." But he couldn't stop his own mind from calculating. If America could build carriers this fast, if they could have 7 in one task force, when Japan had intelligence estimates of 3 total new carriers completed. The implications were staggering. How many carriers did America have? 10? 15? 20? Japan had started the war with 10 carriers of all types. They'd lost 6 Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at Midway, Shoho at Coral Sea, Ryujo at Eastern Solomons. They had 4 left. If America had 20 carriers, the war was already over. Japan just hadn't admitted it yet. The Kate descended to 50 meters above the waves. The approach to Bunker Hill took them through a gauntlet of fire that defied description. Destroyers opened up with every gun they had. Cruisers added their heavier batteries. The carrier herself bristled with dozens of anti-aircraft mounts, from 5-inch guns down to 20mm cannons that created a wall of tracers. Kates were dying around them. Kano watched 3 more go down in flames before they were even within torpedo range. The attack had started with 16 torpedo bombers. Maybe 8 were still flying. Of those 8, maybe 3 would survive to drop torpedoes. Of those 3 torpedoes, maybe 1 would hit. 1 hit on 1 carrier, out of 7. "Range 3,000 meters, Kano called out. "Prepare for release." "Hydraulics are barely responding," Ishida grunted, fighting the controls. "I don't know if the torpedo will release properly." "Make it work," Kano said, because there was nothing else to say. A shell exploded 30 meters to their right. Shrapnel tore through the Kate's right wing, punching dozens of holes in the thin metal. The aircraft yawed wildly. Ishida corrected, but the Kate was clearly struggling. "Fuel pressure critical," Ishida reported. "We're losing fuel fast, maybe 5 minutes before the engine quits." "Then we get the torpedo off in 4 minutes," Kano replied. They were at 1,500 meters now. Kano could see sailors on Bunker Hill's deck, running to battle stations, pointing skyward, manning guns. The carrier was turning, trying to present its narrow bow aspect to reduce the target profile. But at this range, even a turning carrier was nearly impossible to miss. Range 1,000 meters, Cano called. Prepare for release on my mark. 2 more Kates died, shot down by fighters that seemed to come from everywhere. 1 Kate got its torpedo off before exploding. Cano watched the track run true toward a different carrier, strike the hull, and detonate. The plume of water rose 30 meters high. 1 hit. Maybe. Now! Cano shouted. Ishida hit the release. Nothing happened. Hydraulics are dead, Ishida said, his voice tight. Manual release! Cano reached down, found the mechanical backup release lever, and pulled with all his strength. The lever resisted, stuck from damage or mechanical failure. He pulled harder. The torpedo fell away, but they'd flown another 200 meters while fighting the release. The torpedo hit the water at the wrong angle, 300 meters from where Cano had intended. Its track veered left, running wild, missing Bunker Hill by 100 meters. Missed, Cano said flatly. Climb, get us out of here. Ishida pulled back on the stick. The Kate responded sluggishly, climbing at a pathetic rate. Behind them, Morita's machine gun chattered, firing at something, but the small-caliber weapon was hopelessly inadequate against the fighters now swarming the survivors. A Hellcat positioned itself directly behind them, at their altitude, matching their speed. The American pilot had all the time in the world to aim. Cano turned in his seat, made eye contact with the American through the canopy glass. The American was young, maybe 22, wearing a leather flight jacket and headset. He looked calm, professional, almost bored. The Hellcat's guns fired. The tracers seemed to come slowly, drifting toward them. Then they struck. The Kate's engine exploded. The propeller separated and tumbled away. Fire erupted from the engine cowling, spreading rapidly as aviation fuel fed the flames. The cockpit filled with smoke. "We're done!" Ishida shouted. "Bailing out!" Cano reached for the canopy release, but the mechanism was jammed. The canopy wouldn't slide back. They were trapped. "We're trapped!" Morita screamed from behind. The Kate was falling now, nose down, spinning slowly. Through the smoke and chaos, Cano could see the ocean rushing up. They had maybe 10 seconds. Ishida stopped trying to fly and instead kicked at the canopy with both feet. On the third kick, something broke and the canopy slid back partially. Smoke poured out. "Go!" Ishida yelled. Cano unstrapped, stood, and threw himself out of the burning aircraft. The slipstream hit him like a wall, tumbling him head over heels. He pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a bone-jarring jerk. Above him, the Kate fell away, trailing fire. He saw Morita bail out from the rear position, his chute opening seconds later. Ishida didn't make it out. The Kate hit the ocean with a splash, disappeared beneath the waves, and was gone. Just like that. After 4 years of war, after Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea and a dozen other battles, flight. Petty Officer Saburo Ishida was gone. Cano hit the water hard. The parachute dragged him under before he could release it. He fought his way to the surface, gasping, treading water. Around him, the ocean was littered with debris and Japanese aircrew in the water. In the distance, the 7 American carriers steamed serenely, untouched except for maybe 2 or 3 hits from an attack force that had started with almost 100 aircraft. A destroyer was approaching, flying the American flag. They were taking prisoners. Cano had survived Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz only to be captured by an enemy whose industrial capacity he had completely failed to understand. As the destroyer's crew pulled him from the water 20 minutes later, wrapping him in a blanket and leading him below decks with surprising gentleness, Cano asked the question that had haunted him since seeing those 7 carriers. "How many?" he asked in broken English to a young American sailor who was guarding him. How many carriers does America have? The sailor looked confused, then understood the question. He shrugged. I don't know exactly. Maybe 20? 25? They keep building them. Essex-Class carriers. We're going to have 50 of them by next year, or so I heard. Kano closed his eyes. 50 carriers. Japan had 4 left. The mathematics were no longer even mathematics. It was annihilation written in steel and rivets, delivered by a nation that Japan had dismissed as soft and incapable. He had sunk USS Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor. He had helped sink Lexington at Coral Sea. He had flown the best torpedo bomber in the world with the best trained crew in history. He had executed his missions perfectly, and it had meant absolutely nothing. The young American sailor's casual estimate, 50 carriers, haunted every Japanese pilot who survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Within days, word spread through what remained of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. American interrogators, surprised by Japanese ignorance of U.S. industrial capacity, actually showed captured pilots photographs of Essex-class carriers under construction. The images showed something that seemed impossible. Shipyards with 5, 6, 7 carriers in various stages of completion simultaneously. Petty Officer First Class Takeshi Morita, who had bailed out of Kano's Kate and been rescued by a different American destroyer, stared at the photographs in disbelief during his interrogation aboard the carrier USS Lexington, the new Lexington, CV-16, commissioned to replace the carrier Japanese Kates had sunk in 1942. This is propaganda, he insisted in Japanese, while a Nisei translator converted his words to English. No nation can build this many carriers. The American intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, simply shrugged. We're not trying to convince you of anything. We're documenting your knowledge of American capabilities for our records. For what it's worth, those photographs are real. We've commissioned 14 Essex-class carriers so far. 10 more are under construction. We'll probably cancel some of them because the war will be over before they're finished. Morita did the mathematics in his head. 14 Essex-class carriers, each carrying 90,100 aircraft. That was 1,260 to 1,400 aircraft on Essex-class carriers alone. Japan's entire carrier force, what was left of it after the Philippine Sea, could muster maybe 200 operational aircraft. We lost the war at Pearl Harbor, Morita said quietly. Not because we failed to sink your carriers. We lost because we made you angry enough to build 50 more. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American pilots called the Marianas Turkey Shoot, had destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet had launched 373 aircraft in multiple strikes against the American task force. Only 130 returned. The Americans had lost 29 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents. But the kill ratios told only part of the story. What destroyed Japanese carrier aviation wasn't just the loss of aircraft. Those could theoretically be replaced. It was the loss of experienced air crews who couldn't be replaced. By June 1944, Japan was training carrier pilots in 6 months instead of 2 years. The new pilots had 100 flight hours total, compared to the 700 hours that Pearl Harbor veterans had accumulated before seeing combat. Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Nishizawa, a Zero pilot who survived the Philippine Sea by sheer luck, wrote to his family from Truk. The new pilots arrive barely able to land on a carrier. They die on their first mission because they lack the experience to survive. The Americans have experienced pilots flying superior aircraft in unlimited numbers. We have brave children flying obsolete aircraft they barely know how to control. This is not combat. This is slaughter. The Nakajima B-5N2. Kate, once the best torpedo bomber in the world, had become a flying coffin by 1944. Its lack of armor, always a weakness, became fatal when facing the massed fighter defenses that American carriers could now deploy. F-6F Hellcats, each armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns, could destroy a Kate with a single burst. The Kate's single 7.7mm rear gun might as well not have existed. Worse, the Kate's speed advantage, once sufficient to outrun most fighters, had evaporated. In 1941, the Kate's 378 km/h maximum speed exceeded the F-4F Wildcat's cruise speed. By 1944, the F-6F Hellcat cruised at 380 km/h and could sprint to 610 km/h. Kates couldn't outrun, couldn't outmaneuver, and couldn't outfight American fighters. The Japanese Navy knew the Kate was obsolete. The replacement, the Nakajima B-6N Tenzan, codenamed Jill by the Allies, had been in development since 1939, but didn't reach operational squadrons until 1943 due to development problems. By then, it hardly mattered. The Tenzan was faster and more capable than the Kate, but faced the same impossible odds against American fighters and anti-aircraft defenses. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, a staff officer with the 2nd Carrier Division, watched the last effective Kate strike launch from the carrier Hiyo in June 1944. Of 18 Kates that departed, 3 returned. 0 had struck targets successfully. "We are sending them to die," he wrote in his diary. "Every pilot knows it. Every squadron commander knows it. Every admiral knows it. But we have no alternative. We must attack with the forces we have, inadequate though they are." The inadequacy became numerical by late 1944. Japan had started the war with approximately 200 trained carrier pilots. By October 1944, fewer than 100 original Pearl Harbor veterans remained alive and operational. The rest were dead, captured, or too badly injured to fly. Meanwhile, American pilot training had scaled to produce 30,000 new pilots annually. The training took longer than Japan's accelerated program, 7 months of intensive instruction plus carrier qualification, but produced competent aviators who could survive their first combats and gain experience. American pilots flew against experienced instructors using captured Japanese aircraft. They learned Japanese tactics, studied Japanese weaknesses, and practiced until perfect. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated the complete reversal of 1942's carrier warfare dynamics. The Japanese Navy committed 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Sueho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, as a diversionary force. The carriers launched approximately 100 aircraft total. All 4 carriers were sunk by American aircraft operating from Essex-Class carriers that participated almost casually, losing fewer than a dozen aircraft in the process. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, went down on October 25th, taking with her the last symbolic connection to Japan's carrier supremacy. Warrant Officer Takeshi Maeda, flying a Kate on an anti-submarine patrol from Zuikaku when American aircraft struck, watched his carrier die from 20 miles away. "She rolled over slowly," he recorded in a letter to his parents discovered after the war. "I could see sailors jumping from the deck. Then she was gone. I circled the spot where she sank until my fuel ran low. There was nothing else to do. I landed at Luzon with maybe 10 minutes of fuel remaining. When I climbed out of the aircraft, I realized I had witnessed the end of Japanese carrier aviation. Zuikaku was the last link to our great victories. Now there are none. By November 1944, Japan had no operational fleet carriers remaining. The surviving light carriers were kept in port for lack of fuel and aircraft. The remaining Kates, perhaps 200 still existed, were relegated to anti-submarine patrols, reconnaissance missions, and training duties. Their days as ship-killing weapons were over. The final, desperate use of Kates came as kamikaze aircraft. The tactic, officially adopted in October 1944, reflected complete admission of conventional warfare's failure. If Japanese pilots couldn't survive to drop torpedoes, they would crash their aircraft directly into American ships. A Kate loaded with bombs instead of a torpedo, flown by a pilot committed to suicide, became a guided missile. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who led the first organized kamikaze attack from the Philippines, had been a Kate pilot earlier in the war. His diary, published posthumously by his widow, reflected on the transformation. I trained for 4 years to be the best torpedo bomber pilot in the Navy. I learned to drop a torpedo within meters of my aim point from 1,000 meters at 200 knots. I practiced until I could hit a battleship in any sea state, any weather. Now they ask me to simply crash my aircraft into an enemy ship. All that training, all that skill, rendered meaningless because we cannot compete with American material superiority. This is not tactics. This is desperation masquerading as sacrifice. Seki died on October 25, 1944, crashing his Kate into the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The small carrier sank, one of the few American carriers lost in 1944-1945. But the attack required 5 kamikaze aircraft to sink one escort carrier. The mathematics remained brutal. America had commissioned 122 escort carriers in addition to the 24 Essex-Class fleet carriers. Japan could produce kamikaze pilots faster than America could build carriers, but not fast enough to matter. The contrast with 1942 was devastating. In that year, Japanese Kate pilots had sunk 3 American fleet carriers using conventional tactics, superior training, and careful coordination. In 1944 to 1945, it took suicidal desperation to sink even the smallest American carriers, and the tactic couldn't be sustained. By March 1945, American carrier task forces operated with impunity off the Japanese home islands. Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher, routinely fielded 15 to 16 fleet carriers, more carriers than Japan had possessed at the war's peak. The task force's air wing exceeded 1,200 aircraft, each flown by competent pilots supported by unlimited fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The remaining Kates in Japan were grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. The fuel shortages that had plagued Germany were even worse in Japan, which had never possessed adequate petroleum reserves. By April 1945, Japanese aircraft couldn't train because flight training would exhaust fuel reserves needed for desperate defense of the homeland. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack flying in a Kate, was serving as an operations officer in Japan by early 1945. In a post-war interview, he reflected on seeing American carriers bomb the Kure naval base. I stood on a hillside and watched American carrier aircraft bomb our ships in harbor. I counted 300 aircraft in the first wave alone. 300 aircraft. More than sus. We had launched at Pearl Harbor against an enemy who possessed no warning. Now the Americans launched 300 against targets that knew they were coming but could do nothing to stop them. I understood then what we had done. We had awakened a giant, given him purpose, and he had built an industrial machine that could not be stopped by courage or skill or sacrifice. The numbers told the story completely. Japan produced 1,149 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers during the entire war. The aircraft served from 1937 to 1945, achieving remarkable successes in its first 2 years before becoming obsolete. Japanese Kate pilots sank or helped sink USS Lexington, CV-2, USS Yorktown, CV-5, USS Hornet, CV-8, USS Wasp, CV-7. 4 battleships at Pearl Harbor, numerous smaller vessels in return, America commissioned during the war, 24 Essex-Class fleet carriers, 32 ordered, 8 canceled post-war, 9 Independence-class light carriers, escort carriers of various classes. Total, 155 carriers commissioned, 1941, 1945. The replacement rate defied comprehension. For every carrier Japan sank, America commissioned 38. The Essex-class production alone demonstrated industrial capacity that Japanese planners had never imagined. The first Essex took 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. By 1944, construction time had dropped to 16 months. At peak production in 1944, America commissioned 1 Essex-class carrier every 45 days. More damning than the carrier numbers was aircraft production. The 1,149 Kates represented Japan's entire run of torpedo bombers. America produced 9,000 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, the Kate's American equivalent, and considered them merely adequate. Total American aircraft production reached 300 aircraft. Japan managed 6,320 total. But the most crushing comparison was pilot training. America graduated approximately 60,000 naval aviators during the war. Japan trained about 15,000 in total, and most of the experienced pilots, the Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea veterans, were dead by late 1944. The survivors, like Kano, were prisoners. Or they were instructors, grounded by regulations that kept experienced pilots away from combat to preserve training capacity. Or they were dead in administrative duties, like Fuchida, watching the empire crumble. The Battle of Okinawa in April-June 1945 represented Japanese naval aviation's final gasp. The few remaining operational aircraft, including the last Kates, were expended in kamikaze attacks that sank some American ships but couldn't alter the strategic situation. For every American ship sunk, 10 more appeared. For every American aircraft lost, 20 more launched from carriers that seemed infinite in number. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's most successful surviving ace with 64 kills, described encountering an American carrier task force in May 1945. I had faced American carrier aircraft many times. At Guadalcanal in 1942, we fought desperately against 2 or 3 carriers. It was difficult, but possible. In May 1945, I saw an American task force and couldn't count the carriers. 10? 15? They filled the ocean. Each carrier launched fighters that swarmed like bees. For every 0 we had, they had 50 Hellcats. This was not war. This was industrial annihilation. By August 1945, when atomic bombs ended the war, the Nakajima B-5N Kate existed primarily in museums and scrapyards. A few training examples survived at flight schools. Perhaps a dozen operational aircraft remained, grounded for lack of fuel. The weapon that had terrorized American battleships at Pearl Harbor and sunk 3 fleet carriers in 1942, had become a historical curiosity. The Kate's obsolescence reflected larger truths about industrial warfare. Tactical brilliance meant nothing without industrial capacity to sustain operations. Superior training couldn't overcome unlimited enemy resources. Individual heroism couldn't defeat assembly line production of competent pilots flying adequate aircraft in overwhelming numbers. The Japanese pilots who flew Kates weren't defeated by cowardice or incompetence. They were defeated by mathematics. They sank 3 American carriers in 1942, and America responded by building 24 Essex-Class carriers that dwarfed anything Japan could construct. They destroyed hundreds of American aircraft, and America graduated thousands of replacement pilots. They fought with legendary skill and suicidal courage, and it meant nothing against an enemy who could lose 1,000 aircraft and barely notice. In the end, the Nakajima B-5N2, Kate proved that excellence in design, training, and execution were insufficient against industrial abundance. The best torpedo bomber of 1941 became target practice by 1944, not because it failed, but because the enemy it faced could absorb losses, learn from defeats, and return with overwhelming force. The Kate pilots had won every tactical engagement in 1942. They had lost the Industrial War in 1941, before the first torpedo dropped, before the first battle, when Japanese leaders decided to attack a nation with 10 times their industrial capacity. The rest was just counting the cost. Lieutenant Kenzo Kano spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp in Hawaii, ironically within sight of Pearl Harbor, where his torpedo bombing career had begun. In January 1946, during repatriation processing before his return to Japan, an American Navy officer showed him something that completed his understanding of the war he'd fought. It was a chart. Simple, brutal, undeniable. Aircraft carriers commissioned 1941 to 1945. Japan 18 total, all types. United States 155 total. 24 Essex-Class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-Class light carriers, 122 escort carriers. I requested this meeting specifically, the officer said through an interpreter. His name was Lieutenant James Morrison, and he'd been a historian before the war. I wanted you to see this, not to humiliate you, but because I think you deserve to understand what happened. Kano stared at the numbers. 155 carriers. Japan had built 18 and lost most of them. America had built 155 and lost only a handful. The mathematics weren't just unfavorable, they were apocalyptic. The 3 carriers you helped sink, Morrison continued, Lexington, Yorktown, and Hornet. We replaced them with Lexington II, Yorktown II, and Hornet II. Same names, bigger ships, better aircraft, within 18 months. For every carrier you sank, we built 8 more. Why show me this? Kano asked quietly in English. 3 years in the camp had given him functional language skills. Because you were a good pilot, Morrison replied. I've read your file. Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Santa Cruz. You executed your missions perfectly. You did everything right. And it didn't matter. I want you to understand it wasn't your fault. You were fighting mathematics, not just Americans. Kano looked at the chart again. His entire life, the years of training, the combat missions, the comrades lost, had been spent fighting an enemy who could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. He had known this intellectually since the Philippine Sea, but seeing it documented, official, irrefutable, drove the reality home completely. How? He asked. How did you build so many? Morrison pulled out another document. This one showed the shipyards: Newport News, Norfolk, Philadelphia, Bethlehem Quincy, Fore River, and next to each yard, production numbers that seemed impossible. We started building Essex-Class carriers in 1941, Morrison explained. The first one, USS Essex, was commissioned December 31, 1942, 1 year and 8 months from keel laying to commissioning. By mid-1943, we were launching one every 6 weeks. At peak production in 1944, we commissioned one every 45 days. 45 days. Japan required 3 years to build a comparable carrier, if they could afford one, which by 1943 they couldn't. The industrial disparity wasn't just significant, it was civilizational. Your intelligence estimates, Morrison continued, consistently underestimated American production by factors of 5 to 10. Your planners assumed we'd build carriers at the same rate you did. They didn't understand that we had 50 shipyards, unlimited steel, unlimited workers, and unlimited resources. We weren't building one carrier at a time. We were building 10 simultaneously. Kano thought back to October 26, 1942, the day his Kate had helped sink Hornet, the celebration aboard Junyo afterward, the certainty that Japan was winning the attrition war, sinking American carriers faster than they could be replaced. When we sank Hornet, Kano said slowly, how many Essex-class carriers were already under construction? Morrison checked his documents. On October 26, 1942, 13. Essex herself was in final trials and would commission 2 months later. 12 more were in various stages of construction. The hulls existed. The machinery was being installed. The workers were welding them together in shifts around the clock. 13 carriers. While Japanese pilots celebrated sinking one, America was building 13. We never had a chance, Kano said. It wasn't a question. No, Morrison agreed. Not after Pearl Harbor. Maybe not before. The moment your country decided to attack a nation with 10 times your industrial capacity, the outcome was determined. Everything afterward was just counting the cost. The cost had been staggering. Japan lost approximately 1.86 million military personnel. The carrier pilots who had been Japan's elite in 1941, men like Kano, like Fuchida, like the thousands who died over 3 years of combat, were almost entirely gone. Of the roughly 1,200 carrier-qualified pilots Japan had possessed in December 1941, fewer than 100 survived the war. America graduated 60,000 naval aviators during the war. They flew 324,750 aircraft produced by factories that operated 24 hours a day. They operated from 155 carriers that moved like mobile cities across the Pacific. And when Japanese pilots shot down American aircraft, which they did with considerable skill and frequency, it meant nothing. For every American pilot lost, 3 more graduated from training. For every American aircraft destroyed, 10 more rolled off assembly lines. The Essex-class carriers themselves represented American industrial philosophy perfected. Each ship displaced 36,380 tons fully loaded and carried between 90 to 100 aircraft. The flight deck measured 872 feet long, longer than any Japanese carrier ever built. The ships were designed for mass production, using standardized components manufactured in factories across America. The armor protection was moderate, enough to survive kamikaze hits that would have destroyed Japanese carriers, but not excessive. The Americans understood that it was cheaper and faster to build more ships than to make each ship invulnerable. If one Essex sank, 3 more would be commissioned within months. This calculus, quantity through standardization rather than quality through individual craftsmanship, was alien to Japanese military thinking. The production statistics told stories of their own. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolt fighters during the war, more fighters than Japan's entire military aircraft production of 14,000 fighter aircraft total. Ford's Willow Run plant produced 8,085 B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 aircraft every 63 minutes at peak production. One factory, one aircraft type, produced more bombers than Japan-built aircraft of all types in 1944. But the most crushing statistics involved the Nakajima B-5N Kate itself. Japan's 1,149 Kates were matched by 9,139 American TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. The Avenger was heavier, slower, and less maneuverable than the Kate, but it had armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and was produced in sufficient numbers that losing hundreds in combat was acceptable. Attrition. This was the fundamental difference. Japan designed excellent aircraft and trained exceptional pilots, then couldn't afford to lose either. America designed adequate aircraft and trained competent pilots, then produced so many that losses became statistical noise. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, spent decades after the war studying what went wrong. In a 1963 lecture at the U.S. Naval War College, he offered his assessment. "We won every tactical battle in 1942. Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon, Coral Sea. Even at Coral Sea, where we lost Shoho, we sank Lexington, a larger and more valuable ship. At Santa Cruz, we sank Hornet while our carriers survived. We thought we were winning, but we were measuring the wrong things. We counted ships sunk, aircraft destroyed, tactical victories achieved. We didn't count American factories working 3 shifts, shipyards laying multiple keels simultaneously, training programs graduating thousands of pilots monthly. We won 1942 and lost the war. The Americans lost 1942 and won the war. That is the difference between tactics and industry." The Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Kano was shot down, represented the culmination of industrial warfare. The American Task Force, Task Force 58, fielded 15 carriers with 902 aircraft. The Japanese Mobile Fleet fielded 9 carriers with 430 aircraft. But the numbers alone don't capture the disparity. American carriers were Essex-Class ships barely 6 months old, equipped with the latest radar, radio communications, and defensive weapons. Japanese carriers were a mix of aging pre-war ships and hastily converted merchantmen, cobbled together from insufficient resources. American pilots averaged 300 combat hours and flew aircraft with capabilities matching or exceeding Japanese types. Japanese pilots averaged 100 hours total flight time and flew aircraft that were obsolete. When the Americans lost 29 aircraft at the Philippine Sea while destroying 243 Japanese aircraft, they had replacements aboard ship and more arriving from reserve carriers. When Japanese lost their aircraft, those planes and pilots were irreplaceable. The battle destroyed Japanese carrier aviation not because they lost ships, though they did, but because they lost the aircrew that couldn't be regenerated. By October 1944, at Leyte Gulf, the disparity had become surreal. Japan committed 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, as decoys with barely 100 aircraft total. The American Third Fleet, operating off the Philippines, had 32 carriers with over 1,000 aircraft. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk with trivial American losses. The kamikaze tactic, adopted in desperation that same month, represented final admission that conventional carrier warfare was impossible. If pilots couldn't survive to develop skills and aircraft couldn't be replaced, then sacrifice became the only available strategy. But even suicide attacks couldn't overcome the mathematics. Japan expended approximately 2,800 kamikaze aircraft during the war's final months. They sank 47 American ships, damaged 300 more, and killed 5,000 American sailors. But America had 6,184 ships of all types in 1945. Losing 47 was tragic, but sustainable. The naval blockade continued. The carrier raids on Japan intensified. The industrial machine kept producing. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, led the last kamikaze attack of the war on August 15, 1945, hours after Emperor Hirohito announced surrender. Ugaki flew a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber, accompanied by several wingmen, toward Okinawa. None of the aircraft were Kates. By then, few Kates remained operational. The attack achieved nothing, sank no ships, changed no outcomes. Ugaki and his pilots simply vanished, presumably crashing into the ocean when their fuel ran out. It was a fitting end for Japanese naval aviation. Brave men flying obsolete aircraft on a meaningless mission because pride demanded they die fighting rather than accept the reality of industrial defeat. The peace came in September 1945. Kano returned to Japan aboard an American transport ship that had been built in 47 days, less time than it took Japan to train a replacement pilot. He arrived at Yokosuka Naval Base to find it occupied by American forces, American carriers anchored in the harbor, American aircraft on the airfields. The devastation was total. Not just military, but civilian. American bombing had reduced Japanese cities to ash. The 2 atomic bombs had demonstrated weapons against which no defense existed. But Kano understood that the atomic bombs were merely faster versions of what American industry had been doing for 4 years, delivering unstoppable force that Japan couldn't match, couldn't counter, couldn't survive. Walking through the ruins of Yokosuka, Kano encountered Captain Minoru Genda, who had helped plan Pearl Harbor and survived the war through staff assignments. They stood together, watching American sailors unload supplies from ships that seemed endless. "We should have known," Genda said quietly. "All the intelligence was there. American automobile production, steel output, electrical generation. The numbers showed their capacity. We saw what we wanted to see." "Would it have mattered?" Kano asked. "If we'd known the truth about American production, would we have avoided war?" Genda was silent for a long moment. "No," he finally admitted. "The Army wanted war with China. The Navy wanted resources from Southeast Asia. The politicians wanted empire. We would have fought regardless. But maybe we would have fought differently. Maybe we would have sought peace earlier, saved some lives. Or maybe," Kano said, "the outcome was inevitable the moment we attacked Pearl Harbor. Everything afterward was just mathematics playing out." The Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber passed into history as a remarkable aircraft rendered obsolete by circumstances beyond its design. It was genuinely the best torpedo bomber in the world in 1941. Its crews were genuinely the most skilled carrier aviators in the world. Its tactics were genuinely revolutionary. And none of it mattered against an enemy who could produce adequate weapons in unlimited quantities. In 1952, Kano attended a reunion of former Kate pilots. Of the 47 men who had flown Kates from his squadron in December 1941, only 6 survived the war. They gathered in a small restaurant in Tokyo, aging men sharing memories of youth spent in service of a doomed cause. One of them, Nakajima Yoshio, who had been shot down 3 times and survived, offered a toast. To the comrades who didn't come home. They flew the best aircraft we could build, executed their missions perfectly, and proved that excellence isn't enough when facing abundance. The glasses were raised, sake consumed, and silence fell. What was there to say? They had been the elite. They had won the tactical battles. They had done everything their nation asked, and they had lost everything because their nation chose to fight a war it couldn't win. The final irony came in 1969 when Lieutenant Commander Kenzo Kano, who had become a commercial pilot after the war, flew aboard a Japan Airlines flight from Tokyo to Honolulu. He was visiting Pearl Harbor as a tourist, returning to where his military career had begun 28 years earlier. Standing at the Arizona Memorial, looking down at the rusting hulk of the battleship his torpedo had helped sink, Kano encountered another visitor, retired Admiral James Morrison, the historian who had shown him the carrier production charts in 1946. They recognized each other immediately. "I remember you," Morrison said in Japanese, which he'd studied after the war. "The Kate pilot, Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Santa Cruz. You did your job well." "It didn't matter," Kano replied in English. "You built 155 carriers. We built 18. The war was over before it began." Morrison nodded. "But you didn't know that in October 1942, did you? When you sank Hornet, you thought you were winning." Kano thought back to that October morning, 27 years ago. The celebration aboard Junyo, the certainty that Japan was destroying American carrier power faster than it could be replaced, the conviction that mathematics favored Japan. How utterly wrong it had all been. "We thought we were winning," Kano confirmed. "We counted 3 carriers sunk, Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, and thought America was running out of carriers. We didn't know you were building dozens. We saw our victories and missed your factories." "You were measuring the wrong things," Morrison said. "You measured battles. We measured production capacity. You counted ships sunk. We counted ships launched. In the end, industrial war isn't won by the side that fights best. It's won by the side that builds most." They stood together in silence, watching tourists photograph the memorial. Japanese families, American families, taking pictures of history that had claimed so many lives because nations miscalculated what war with each other would mean. "The Kate was a beautiful aircraft," Morrison finally said. "I've studied it extensively. In 1941, it was genuinely superior to anything we had. Your crews were better trained. Your tactics were innovative. You deserved to win tactically. But we lost strategically," Kano finished, "because we attacked a nation that could lose battles and still win wars." Morrison offered his hand. Kano shook it. 2 old men, once enemies, united in understanding that they'd both been caught in forces larger than individual skill or courage could overcome. As Kano flew back to Japan that evening, looking down at the Pacific where so many of his comrades had died, he thought about the mathematics that had doomed them. 3 carriers sunk by Kates in 1942. 24 Essex-Class carriers built in response. For every victory Japan achieved, America's industrial machine delivered overwhelming counterforce. The Nakajima B-5. Kate had been the best torpedo bomber of its time. Its pilots had been the most skilled in the world. They had achieved tactical perfection. And they had lost to assembly lines, shift workers, and industrial capacity they never understood. The lesson was brutal and eternal. In modern warfare, excellence is not enough. Victory belongs not to those who fight best, but to those who can sustain fighting longest. The side that can replace losses, regenerate forces, and overwhelm opposition through sheer material abundance will prevail regardless of individual heroism or tactical brilliance. Japan's Kate pilots learned this lesson between 1942 and 1945, one lost battle at a time. By the time they understood, millions were dead, their nation was destroyed, and American carriers filled every ocean. The mathematics had played out exactly as the numbers predicted, indifferent to courage, skill, or sacrifice. Those who won every battle lost the war. Those who lost battles built their way to victory. And the difference was measured in shipyards, factories, and industrial capacity that turned steel into ships faster than enemies could sink them. If you appreciate World War II history told through deep research and human stories rather than surface-level narratives, this channel exists to bring that depth to every topic. The scripts here are built from primary sources, veteran testimonies, and hundreds of hours of research into the details that reveal larger truths. Subscribe to support this approach to historical storytelling. There's no clickbait here, just carefully researched history that deserves to be told well.